Welcome viewer, if you enjoy these journeys into the stories that shape our world, consider subscribing for more tales like this one. Now let us begin. To understand the man who would be called the lawgiver, we must first understand the terror that shaped his birth. The book of Exodus opens not with a hero, but with a nation in bondage. The children of Israel, the descendants of Jacob and his 12 sons who had first come to Egypt centuries before as honored guests, had now grown numerous. They had multiplied in the fertile delta of the Nile, their numbers swelling from a small clan into a great and teeming people. And what was once a source of strength had become, in the eyes of a new and fearful dynasty of pharaohs, a source of profound political anxiety. A new king arose over Egypt, one who did not know Joseph. This single, chilling phrase signifies a monumental shift. The memory of Joseph, the Hebrew viceroy who had saved Egypt from famine, was gone. The era of favor was over. In its place was suspicion, paranoia, and the cold calculus of power. The new pharaoh looked upon the Hebrews and saw not a loyal minority, but a potential fifth column, a demographic time bomb ticking in the heart of his kingdom. "Behold," he said to his court, "the people of the children of Israel are more and numerous and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and, if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." The fear was twofold: the fear of internal rebellion and the fear of an alliance with Egypt's external enemies, the rival empires of the Hittites or the peoples of the Levant. The solution was a policy of brutal, systematic oppression designed to break the spirit and curb the growth of the Hebrew people. The first stage was enslavement. The Hebrews were conscripted into forced labor gangs and put to work on Pharaoh's colossal building projects. They were tasked with building the great supply cities of Pithom and Ramesses. Imagine the scene: the relentless Egyptian sun beating down on the backs of thousands of men. The air is thick with the dust of clay and straw. The sound is a symphony of misery: the crack of the overseer's whip, the rhythmic chanting of men hauling massive blocks of stone, the grunts of exhaustion as they mix endless tons of mud and straw for the brick molds. Their labor built the monuments to Pharaoh's glory, their sweat and suffering mortared into the very foundations of Egyptian power. But the policy failed in its primary objective. The text tells us with a kind of grim, divine irony, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and the more they spread abroad. The brutal labor intended to crush them only seemed to make them stronger, more resilient. Pharaoh, seeing that his first plan had failed, escalated his cruelty to a new and more terrible level. He summoned the two chief Hebrew midwives, women named Shiphrah and Puah, and gave them a secret genocidal command. "When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool," he ordered, "if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, she shall live." This was a command to commit murder at the most vulnerable moment of human life, to turn the hands of the healers into the hands of the executioner. It was a policy of targeted extermination, aimed at eliminating the future soldiers, the future patriarchs, the future strength of the Hebrew nation, while preserving the women to be assimilated or used as slaves. But the midwives, in an extraordinary act of quiet, courageous civil disobedience, refused to obey. The text says that they feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. When a furious Pharaoh summoned them to account for their failure, they offered a clever face-saving excuse. "The Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women," they explained. "They are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." It was a plausible lie that played on Egyptian stereotypes of the Hebrews as being more rustic and hardy. Pharaoh was thwarted, but his determination to solve his Hebrew problem now reached a final, monstrous crescendo. "It is into this world, a world of whips and mud and a river filled with weeping, that a child is born. A man from the house of Levi, the priestly tribe of Israel, had taken a wife from the same tribe. Their names, we are told later, were Amram and Jochebed. They already had 2 children, a young girl named Miriam and a boy named Aaron. Now, a third child was born, another son. The text tells us that when his mother looked upon him, she saw that he was a fine child." The Hebrew word used, tov, is the same word used in the book of Genesis to describe God's creation. "And God saw that it was good." It signifies a child of special grace, of divine potential. Faced with the pharaoh's horrific decree, this mother's love transformed into a fierce, defiant courage. She would not surrender her beautiful son to the river. She would defy the god-king of Egypt. For 3 months, she hid him. This would have been an ordeal of unimaginable stress. A newborn baby is not a silent creature. Every cry, every whimper would have sent a jolt of terror through the household. Every passing neighbor, every official was a potential threat. The secret would have been a suffocating burden on the entire family, a conspiracy of love held together by whispers and constant fear. But a growing baby cannot be hidden forever. His cries would become louder, his presence impossible to conceal. Jochebed knew that her time was running out. She had to devise a new plan, a final desperate gamble that was both an act of surrender to the pharaoh's decree and a radical act of faith in her own God. She could no longer hide her son, so she would do as the pharaoh had commanded. She would place him in the Nile, but she would not throw him into the churning currents to drown. She would build him an ark. The Hebrew word used for this vessel, teva, is significant. It is used only one other time in the entire Bible, to describe the great ark that Noah built to survive the flood. Just as Noah's ark was a vessel of salvation, designed to carry the hope of humanity through a world of watery death, so too would be this tiny personal ark. Jochebed wove it herself from papyrus reeds, the same material used for Egyptian fishing skiffs. Then she meticulously sealed it, making it waterproof by plastering it with bitumen and pitch. It was an act of profound maternal care, every strand of papyrus woven with a prayer, every smear of pitch a seal against death. She then placed her 3-month-old son inside this floating cradle. She carried him down to the riverbank, to the edge of the very river that was supposed to be his grave. She did not place him in the open current, but gently laid the basket among the thick reeds that grew along the bank, a place of relative shelter and concealment. And then she made the most painful choice a mother can make. She walked away, leaving her child's fate in the hands of God and chance. But she did not leave him entirely alone. His older sister, Miriam, was posted at a distance, a hidden sentinel tasked with watching over her baby brother to see what would become of him. Miriam's vigil is a silent, powerful testament to a sister's love and the family's shared, desperate hope. And then, the miraculous, seemingly coincidental event upon which the entire history of a nation would turn. The daughter of Pharaoh herself came down to the river to bathe, accompanied by her retinue of handmaidens. As she walked along the bank, she saw the strange basket nestled among the reeds. Her curiosity piqued. She sent one of her maids to fetch it. When she opened the basket, she saw the baby inside. And behold, the text says, the baby was crying. This simple human detail is crucial. The sound of a baby's cry is a universal trigger for compassion, a sound that transcends culture and status. Pharaoh's daughter looked upon the child and her heart was moved. The text says, she took pity on him. And in that moment, she understood everything. This is one of the Hebrews' children, she said. She knew of her father's brutal decree. She knew this child was a condemned fugitive, a piece of human contraband. And yet she chose compassion over obedience. It is at this precise moment that the quick-witted Miriam chose to reveal herself. Seeing the princess's pity, she approached and asked a carefully worded, brilliant question. "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" She did not reveal her relationship to the baby. She presented herself as a helpful local girl, offering a practical solution to the princess's newfound problem. The princess, who now had a baby she could not possibly nurse herself, readily agreed. "Go," she said. And so, Miriam ran and fetched the only person in the world who could provide the perfect comfort and nourishment for this child, his own mother. What followed was a scene of breathtaking clandestine providence. Jochebed, the mother who had been forced to abandon her son to the river, was now brought before the daughter of the very man who had ordered his death. Pharaoh's daughter, unaware of the true relationship, formally hired Jochebed to be the child's wet nurse. "Take this child away and nurse him for me," she commanded, "and I will give you your wages." It was a moment of supreme poetic justice. The Hebrew mother was now being paid by the Egyptian state to raise her own son, the son the state had condemned to death. She was able to take him home, to nurse him, to love him, to instill in him in his earliest, most formative years the stories and the faith of his own people, all under the official protection and patronage of the royal house. When the child was weaned, after perhaps 2 or 3 years, Jochebed fulfilled her part of the bargain. She brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, who then formally adopted him as her own son. She gave him a name that would forever signify his story. She called him Moses. The name in Hebrew sounds like the verb to draw out, mashah. Because, she said, I drew him out of the water. But the name is also strikingly similar to an Egyptian root, Mose, meaning is born or son of, a common element in pharaonic names like Thutmose, son of Thoth, or Ramos, son of Ra. His very name embodied his dual identity. He was the one drawn out, the Hebrew saved from the water, and he was also son of, an Egyptian prince, a child of the royal house. And so began the strange, fractured and privileged upbringing of Moses. He was raised in the splendor and luxury of the Egyptian court, one of the most sophisticated and powerful civilizations of the ancient world. He would have received the finest education available. He would have been taught to read and write the complex hieroglyphic script, to master mathematics and engineering, the skills that built the pyramids and the great temples. He would have been tutored in Egyptian history, theology, and statecraft. He would have been trained in the arts of war, in archery and chariot warfare. He was, to all outward appearances, a prince of Egypt, a young man being groomed for a position of leadership and power within the imperial system. He lived in a gilded cage, surrounded by wealth, learning, and authority. But this gilded cage had a secret, hidden door. He was a man of 2 bloods, a Hebrew living as an Egyptian. He knew his origins. He knew that the slaves he saw toiling in the sun were his own people. He knew that the God King, who was his adoptive grandfather, was the same man who had tried to murder him at birth. This created a profound and unbearable internal conflict. Every day of his life would have been a performance, a careful balancing act. He had to suppress his true identity, to act the part of the Egyptian prince, while knowing that his very existence was a defiance of that world. The privilege he enjoyed was a constant, bitter reminder of the suffering of his brethren. He ate fine food while they starved on meager rations. He slept in a soft bed while they slept on the hard ground. He was a man living a lie, and this internal dissonance, this psychological fracture, must have grown more pronounced as he grew from a boy into a man. The breaking point finally came when Moses was a grown man, perhaps 40 years old. The text says that he went out to his people and looked on their burdens. This was a deliberate act. He was no longer content to live within the palace walls. He went out to see the reality of the slavery his people endured, and there he witnessed a scene that would shatter his carefully constructed world forever. He saw an Egyptian taskmaster brutally beating a Hebrew slave. In that moment, the 40 years of suppressed identity, of simmering rage and guilt, exploded to the surface. The prince's veneer cracked and the Hebrew blood boiled. He looked this way and that, the text says, a perfect cinematic detail of a man checking for witnesses. And when he saw that there was no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. It was a sudden, violent, and irrevocable act. In a single moment of rage, he had thrown away his entire life. He had murdered an agent of the state. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. He had chosen a side. He had chosen his people. The next day, his crisis deepened. He went out again and saw 2 Hebrews fighting with each other. He tried to intervene, to act as a peacemaker, taking on the role of a leader among his own people. "Why do you strike your companion?" he asked the one in the wrong, but the man's response struck him with the force of a physical blow. "Who made you a prince and a judge over us?" the man sneered. "Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" The words were a dagger to Moses' heart. His secret was out. His act of righteous fury, his attempt to defend his people, was known. And worse, it was being thrown back in his face, not by an Egyptian, but by one of the very people he had tried to save. He was not seen as a liberator. He was seen as a dangerous, murderous upstart. His attempt to bridge his 2 worlds had failed catastrophically. He was rejected by the Egyptians as a murderer, and he was rejected by the Hebrews as an illegitimate ruler. He belonged nowhere. Then Moses was afraid, the text tells us, and thought, surely the thing is known. His fear was well-founded. News of the murder quickly reached Pharaoh. The act was not just murder, it was treason. A member of the royal household had killed a state official in defense of a slave. Pharaoh sought to kill Moses. The gilded cage had become a death trap. There was only one option left. Moses, the prince of Egypt, the child of two worlds, abandoned everything. He fled from the palace, from the city, from the entire land of Egypt. He ran eastward into the vast, empty, and unforgiving wilderness of the Sinai Peninsula. He was no longer a prince. He was a fugitive, an exile, a broken man running from the wreckage of his own life, with the blood of an Egyptian on his hands and the scorn of his own people in his ears. The first great act of his life was over, and it had ended in complete and total failure. He was disappearing into the silence of the desert, unaware that this brutal exile was not an end, but a necessary, agonizing prelude to a destiny he could never have imagined. The gates of Egypt had closed behind him. The life of the prince, with its silks, its chariots, its libraries, and its suffocating secrets, was gone, erased by a single, impulsive act of violence. Moses the Egyptian was dead, buried in the same sand as the overseer he had killed. Now only Moses the fugitive remained. He fled eastward, a man with no title, no destination, and no future, disappearing into the vast, silent, and unforgiving emptiness of the Sinai wilderness. This was not just a journey across a physical landscape. It was a journey into obscurity, into a great and profound silence that would last for 40 years. This was the long, slow, and necessary crucible that would burn away the man he had been, preparing him for a destiny he did not want and an encounter with a God he did not yet truly know. This is the story of the fugitive and the fire. The Sinai Peninsula is a place of brutal, majestic, and soul-crushing beauty. It is a world of rock and sand and sky, a landscape of jagged, sun-scorched mountains and vast, empty plains, where the silence is so profound it feels like a physical presence. The sun is a relentless hammer, the heat shimmering off the rocks, distorting the very air. Water is a scarce and precious miracle, dictating the rhythm of all life. It is a land that strips away all that is non-essential, a place where a man is forced into a direct and constant confrontation with his own insignificance in the face of an ancient and indifferent creation. This was the world that Moses now entered. A world that could not have been more different from the lush, ordered, and crowded banks of the Nile. He journeyed until he reached the land of Midian, a territory in what is now northwestern Arabia, across the Gulf of Aqaba from the Sinai proper. The Midianites were a semi-nomadic people, distant relatives of the Hebrews, for they were said to be descended from Abraham through his wife Keturah. Here, Moses was a stranger, an alien, a man without a tribe or a family. The text paints a picture of his arrival, a scene of exhaustion and quiet despair. He sat down by a well. A well in the desert is the center of all life, a place of gathering, of commerce, of news. For Moses, it was simply a place to stop, a place to rest his weary body and contemplate the wreckage of his life. He was a man who had been raised to command armies and help govern an empire, and he was now a nameless fugitive, sitting alone by a well in a foreign land. It was here, at this low point, that his life took an unexpected turn. The 7 daughters of the local priest of Midian, a man named Reuel, also known as Jethro, came to the well to draw water for their father's flocks. But as they tried to fill the troughs, a group of male shepherds arrived and aggressively drove them away, a common act of bullying and assertion of dominance at a shared resource. Moses, who had been sitting and observing, was stirred to action. The same instinct for justice that had caused him to strike down the Egyptian overseer now resurfaced, but this time it was tempered, controlled. He did not resort to violence. Instead, he stood up, intervened on behalf of the young women, drove off the bullying shepherds, and then, in a gesture of simple kindness, he drew water for their flocks himself. When the daughters returned home to their father Jethro earlier than usual, he was surprised. "How is it that you have come so soon today?" he asked. They explained what had happened. An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds and even drew water for us and watered the flock. It is a poignant detail that they identified him as an Egyptian. His 40 years in the palace had marked him. His accent, his bearing, his mannerisms, they were still those of the world he had fled. Jethro, a wise and hospitable man, immediately recognized the significance of the act. "And where is he?" he demanded of his daughters. "Why have you left the man? Call him, that he may eat bread." Moses was brought into the household of Jethro, and in this family of Midianite shepherds, the fugitive found a new home. The text tells us, "And Moses was content to dwell with the man." That word, content, speaks volumes. It is not the word for a man pursuing a great ambition or living a life of passion. It is the word for a man who has accepted a lesser, quieter fate, a man who is grateful for simple safety and acceptance. He had found a refuge from his past. Jethro, seeing the quality of the man, gave him his daughter Zipporah as a wife. The former prince of Egypt became a son-in-law to a desert priest. With Zipporah, Moses had a son, and the name he gave his son is a window into the deep melancholy of his soul during this long exile. He named him Gershom, explaining, "For I have been a sojourner in a foreign land." The name, meaning a stranger there, was a constant reminder of his status. Even here, in this new family, with this new wife and child, he was not truly home. He was an alien, a man defined by what he had lost. His past life in Egypt was a foreign land. His new life in Midian was a foreign land. And the land of his ancestors, the land of Canaan he had surely heard about in the stories his mother had whispered to him, was a land he had never seen. He was a man who belonged nowhere. And so began the long silence. The Bible dedicates only a few verses to this period of Moses' life, yet it lasted for 40 years. It was an immense passage of time, a span in which an entire generation is born and dies. For 4 decades, Moses lived the life of a simple shepherd. He would have learned the rhythms of the desert, the names of the stars, the subtle signs that indicated a change in weather, the locations of every hidden spring and patch of pasture. He would lead his father-in-law's flocks through the stark, beautiful landscape, his daily companions the sheep and the immense silence of the wilderness. This was a life of profound obscurity. He was no longer a man of importance. He was no longer involved in the great affairs of nations. He was just a shepherd, a husband, a father. The fire of his youthful rage and his passion for justice would have cooled over these long years, banking down into the quiet embers of resignation. The trauma of his past would have become a distant memory, a story he perhaps never even told his own wife. He grew old in the desert. His body, once accustomed to the soft life of a palace, would have become lean and hardened by the sun and the wind. His hands would be calloused from his shepherd's staff. He was 80 years old. The man who had once been a prince, the man who had murdered another in a fit of righteous anger, was gone. In his place was an old, weary shepherd who had made his peace with a small, quiet and forgotten life. He had a family, he had work, he had safety. It was not the life he had been born to, but it was a life. He could have reasonably expected to live out the rest of his days in this manner, to die in obscurity, and to be buried in the rocky soil of Midian, his strange, dramatic story known to no one. But the God of his ancestors had not forgotten him, and the silence of the desert was about to be broken by a voice that would change the course of human history. One day, while leading his flock through the wilderness, Moses came to a place called Horeb, which the text identifies as the mountain of God. This is another name for Mount Sinai, a place already considered sacred, a place where the divine was thought to touch the earth. He was on the far side of the wilderness, a place of deep isolation and power, and it was there that he saw it. A sight that was both impossible and undeniably real. He saw a bush, a common thorny acacia bush of the desert that was engulfed in flames, yet it was not being consumed. The fire burned with a fierce, brilliant light, but the leaves were not scorched, the branches were not turned to ash. It was a paradox, a violation of the laws of nature, a fire that was alive but did not destroy. Curiosity, the instinct of a man accustomed to observing the subtle signs of the desert, overcame him. "I will turn aside to see this great sight," he said to himself. "Why the bush is not burned." And as he turned to approach the burning bush, the silence was shattered. A voice called out to him from the heart of the fire, "Moses! Moses!" The sound of his own name, spoken aloud in this vast emptiness, must have been a profound shock. He answered with the simple, reflexive reply of a man addressed by a superior. "Here I am." Then the voice from the fire issued a command that established the terrifying nature of this encounter. "Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." This was not a casual conversation. Moses had stumbled into a sanctuary, into the immediate, unshielded presence of the divine, a presence so pure and so powerful that the very earth beneath his feet had become sacred. He was in the presence of the holy, a reality that is utterly separate, utterly other, and fundamentally dangerous to mortal man. The text tells us that Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. He understood instinctively that to look directly upon the source of this voice would be to die. The voice then identified itself. "I am the God of your father," it declared, "the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." This was not a new, local, desert deity. This was the God of his own history, the God of the covenant, the God whose stories he had learned as a child on his mother's knee. And this God had not been silent out of indifference. He had seen the suffering of his people. "I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them." And then came the words that would shatter Moses' quiet, resigned life forever. "Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." The command was so audacious, so far beyond the realm of possibility, that Moses' response was not one of enthusiasm, but of pure, unadulterated shock and terror. This was not a destiny he wanted. He was not a hero waiting for his call to adventure. He was an old, broken man who had spent 40 years in hiding. The rest of the conversation is not a story of a prophet eagerly accepting his mission. It is the story of a man desperately, passionately trying to get out of it. Moses offered 5 distinct, deeply human objections, 5 powerful arguments for why God had chosen the wrong man. His first objection was one of profound personal inadequacy. "Who am I," he asked, "that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" It is the cry of a man crushed by a lifetime of failure. "Who am I? I am a murderer. I am a fugitive. I am a man who was rejected by his own people. I am an 80-year-old shepherd. How can a person like me possibly confront the most powerful man on earth and lead a nation?" God's answer is not to build up Moses' self-esteem. He does not say, "You are a great leader." He says simply, "But I will be with you." The success of the mission will not depend on Moses' strength, but on God's presence. Moses, undeterred, raised a second, more sophisticated objection. It was a theological and practical problem. "If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' what shall I say to them?" This was a crucial question in a polytheistic world. A God's name was the source of his power, his identity, his essence. To know a God's name was to have a claim on him. What was the name of this God who had been silent for so long? God's answer from the heart of the fire is one of the most mysterious, profound, and pivotal moments in the history of Western thought. He said to Moses, "I am who I am." Or, as it can also be translated, "I will be what I will be." He then commanded, "Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you." This name, represented in the Hebrew text by the 4 consonants YHWH, the tetragrammaton, is not a simple label. It is a statement of pure, dynamic, and untamable being. It is a name that refuses to be defined or controlled. It signifies a God who is not a static object or a force of nature, but a living, active presence. A God whose essence is existence itself, and whose character will be revealed not in a title, but in his future actions. Moses, the man who felt like a nobody, was being sent in the authority of the God who is the definition of somebody. Still, Moses resisted. He raised a third objection, a practical one born of his past rejection. "But behold," he argued, "they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, "The Lord did not appear to you." It was a legitimate fear. Why should this nation of slaves believe that their God had suddenly, after centuries of silence, chosen to speak to this long-forgotten shepherd with an Egyptian accent? In response, God provided Moses with 3 miraculous signs to serve as his credentials. He commanded Moses to throw down his shepherd's staff, and it became a serpent. He commanded him to pick it up by the tail, and it became a staff again. He commanded him to put his hand inside his cloak, and when he drew it out, it was leprous, white as snow. He commanded him to put it back, and when he drew it out again, it was restored. And if they still did not believe, God promised a 3rd sign. Moses would take water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and it would become blood. These were not mere magic tricks. They were signs of a terrifying power over nature, life, death, and the very symbols of Egypt itself. Even this was not enough to persuade the reluctant prophet. He fell back on his deepest and most personal insecurity. He offered his 4th objection. "O my Lord, I am not a man of words, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue." This is the plea of a man convinced of his own inadequacy as a public figure. Whether he had a literal speech impediment, like a stutter, or was simply a man whose 40 years of desert silence had made him awkward and uneloquent, he felt utterly incapable of being a great orator, a spokesman for God. God's response was a sharp, almost angry rebuke. "Who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak." It was a reminder that even Moses' weakness was within God's sovereign control. At this point, Moses had run out of logical objections. He was cornered. His final plea was nothing more than a raw, desperate cry of avoidance. "Oh my Lord," he begged, "please send someone else." It is one of the most painfully honest moments in the entire Bible. The man chosen by God to be the great liberator wants nothing to do with the job. He is not a hero. He is a man who craves only the quiet, anonymous life he has built for himself. The text says that the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. But even in his anger, God made a concession to Moses' weakness. He did not choose someone else. Instead, he appointed Moses' own brother, Aaron the Levite, to be his spokesman. "He shall be your mouth," God commanded, "and you shall be as God to him." The partnership was formed. Moses would be the vessel of God's will, and Aaron would be the eloquent mouthpiece. The conversation was over. The objections had been answered, the concessions made. Moses, the 80-year-old fugitive shepherd, had his commission. He had been given a name for his God, a set of miraculous signs for his credentials, and a brother for his voice. He had no more excuses. He turned from the unconsumed fire, took his sandals, and began the long journey back down the mountain. The 40-year silence was over. The man who had run from his destiny was now being sent back by a terrifying and irresistible force to confront the empire that had made him and the people who had rejected him. His exile had ended. His true and terrible purpose was about to begin. The fire on the mountain had faded, but its heat now burned within the soul of the reluctant prophet. Moses, the 80-year-old shepherd, a man who had made his peace with obscurity, was now a man with a divine and terrifying commission. He had argued with the voice from the flames, had pleaded his own inadequacy, had begged to be spared this terrible honor. But the divine will was absolute. He was to return to the land of his birth, to the source of his deepest trauma, and confront the most powerful man on earth. He was to be the instrument of liberation for a nation of slaves who did not know him, and a messenger for a God they had all but forgotten. This is the story of his unwanted return, the beginning of a mission that would start not with a heroic victory, but with a catastrophic failure, a disaster that would see him rejected not only by the God-King Pharaoh, but by the very people he had been sent to save. His first steps back towards civilization were hesitant, fraught with the enormity of his task. He returned from the mountain to the home of his father-in-law, Jethro, the man who had given him sanctuary for 4 decades. He did not, it seems, tell Jethro the full, incredible story of the burning bush. To do so would have been to invite disbelief, to speak of things that were beyond the realm of normal human experience. Instead, he framed his request in simple, understandable terms. "Please let me go back to my relatives in Egypt to see if they are still alive," he asked. It was a request born of familial duty, a plausible reason for an old man to wish to see his homeland one last time. Jethro, the good and hospitable priest, gave him his blessing. "Go in peace," he said. The die was cast. The journey from Midian back to the frontiers of Egypt would have been a long and arduous one, a reversal of the desperate flight he had made 40 years earlier. This time he was not alone. He traveled with his wife, Zipporah, and his 2 sons. He was no longer a fugitive running for his life, but a man walking deliberately towards a confrontation he dreaded. As he traveled, God met him again, sending his older brother Aaron out into the wilderness to find him. Aaron was everything Moses was not. Where Moses was slow of speech, a man of the silent desert, Aaron was an eloquent man, a Levite who had remained in Egypt, a leader among the Hebrews, a man who knew how to speak the language of his people. Their reunion at the foot of the mountain of God was the formation of the prophetic partnership that would define the Exodus. Moses, the vessel of God's raw, terrifying will, told Aaron everything about the fire, the voice, the commission, the signs. And Aaron, the pragmatist, the speaker, agreed to become his brother's mouth. Together, they entered Egypt and gathered the elders of the children of Israel. This was their first test. Would the leaders of the enslaved nation believe their incredible story? It was Aaron who spoke, his voice giving form and fluency to the experiences of his hesitant brother. He recounted the appearance of the God of their fathers, the promise of deliverance, the commission given to Moses. And then Moses performed the signs. In the presence of the elders, he cast down his staff, and it became a serpent. He put his hand in his cloak and drew it out, leprous and white, then restored it. The effect was immediate and profound. The text tells us that the people believed, and when they heard that the Lord had visited the children of Israel and that he had seen their affliction, they bowed their heads and worshipped. For the first time, a flicker of hope. The elders were convinced. The people were on their side. Buoyed by this initial success, Moses and Aaron prepared for the ultimate confrontation, the audience with Pharaoh himself. They entered the royal court of Egypt, a place of immense, intimidating power. This was a world Moses knew, but had not seen in 40 years. The vast columned halls, the intricate hieroglyphs celebrating the pharaoh's military victories and divine status, the stern-faced guards, the bowing courtiers, it was all designed to overwhelm and intimidate any visitor, to impress upon them the absolute and unassailable power of the man who was considered a living god. Moses and Aaron, 2 elderly representatives of a slave people, stood before this magnificent throne. It is possible that this Pharaoh was not the one from whom Moses had fled, that the old king had died during Moses' long exile. But the new Pharaoh embodied the same divine arrogance, the same institutional contempt for the Hebrews. Through Aaron, Moses delivered his message, and it was not a polite request. It was not a plea for mercy or a negotiation. It was a direct, uncompromising command from a higher authority. "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel," Aaron declared, "let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness." The demand itself was a challenge. They were claiming that there was a God, the God of this slave nation, who was superior to Pharaoh and who could command him. Pharaoh's response was one of pure, scornful, and utter contempt. "Who is the Lord," he sneered, "that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." To Pharaoh, this was an absurdity. He was a god on earth, the incarnation of Horus. His authority was absolute. The gods he recognized were the powerful ancient pantheon of Egypt: Ra, Osiris, Isis, Amun. The idea that some obscure tribal deity of his slaves, a god whose name he had never even heard, could issue commands to him was not just insulting, it was laughable. It was a challenge to the entire cosmic and political order of his universe. He saw Moses and Aaron not as prophets, but as dangerous agitators, troublemakers stirring up dissent among the valuable state workforce. Moses and Aaron tried a softer approach, framing the request as a matter of religious necessity to avoid divine punishment. "The God of the Hebrews has met with us," they said. "Please let us go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. lest he fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword." But Pharaoh was unmoved. He saw their request as nothing more than a lazy pretext for the slaves to shirk their duties. "Moses and Aaron, why do you take the people away from their work?" he demanded. "Get back to your burdens." The audience was a catastrophic failure. They had not only failed to persuade Pharaoh, but they had angered him. And Pharaoh, to demonstrate his absolute power and to punish this insolence, decided to make the Hebrews' lives even more miserable. He issued a new, cruel decree. "You shall no longer give the people straw to make bricks, as in the past. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. But the number of bricks they make, you shall lay on them. You shall not lessen it, for they are idle. That is why they are crying out, 'Let us go and sacrifice to our God.' Let heavier work be laid on the men that they may labor at it and pay no regard to lying words." This was an act of calculated, sadistic cruelty. Making bricks without straw is not impossible, but it is immensely more difficult. The straw was not just for fuel, it was a crucial binding agent that, when mixed with the Nile mud and clay, gave the bricks their strength and durability. Without it, the bricks would be weak, brittle, and prone to cracking. The command to produce the same quota of bricks while also forcing the slaves to spend hours scouring the fields for scraps of stubble was a command to do the impossible. It was a policy designed to break them, to crush their spirits so thoroughly that they would have no energy left for rebellion or for listening to the lying words of their supposed liberators. The Egyptian taskmasters enforced the new decree with ruthless efficiency. They beat the Hebrew foremen, the lower-level supervisors drawn from among the slaves themselves. "Why have you not completed your task of making bricks today, as in the past?" they would demand, punctuating their questions with the lash. The people's brief flicker of hope was extinguished and replaced by a new, more profound despair. Their situation was now demonstrably worse than it had been before Moses and Aaron had arrived, and so the people turned on their would-be saviors. The Hebrew foremen, their backs raw from the overseers' whips, confronted Moses and Aaron with bitter fury. "The Lord look on you and judge," they cried, "because you have made us stink in the sight of Pharaoh and his servants and have put a sword in their hand to kill us." It was a complete and total rejection. They were not just questioning Moses' strategy, they were accusing him of being an agent of their destruction. They were saying that his divine mission had done nothing but make their unbearable suffering even more acute. This was the absolute nadir for Moses. He had been rejected by Pharaoh, who saw him as a nuisance, and now he was being rejected by his own people, who saw him as a curse. His entire mission, ordained by a voice from a burning bush, had collapsed into a disastrous failure. He had succeeded only in making things worse. In his despair, Moses turned back to God with a cry of anguish that is one of the most raw and human prayers in the Bible. "O Lord," he said, "why have you done evil to this people? Why did you ever send me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to this people, and you have not delivered your people at all." It is a prayer of profound disillusionment. Moses accuses God himself of doing evil. He questions his own calling, seeing his mission as a source of suffering, not salvation. He points out the stark, undeniable fact: God's promises had not been fulfilled. The people were not delivered. This moment reveals the immense psychological burden of the prophet. He is the man caught in the middle, the man who has to bear the anger of the people when the divine promises seem to fail, and who has to carry the people's pain back to the God who sent him. But God's response to Moses' despair is not one of sympathy, but of renewed, terrifying promise. "Now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh," God declared. He reiterated his covenant promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He repeated his own sacred name, YHWH, and stated that now, through these coming acts, the full meaning of that name would be revealed. He commanded Moses to go back to the people and repeat the promise of deliverance. But when Moses did so, the text says, they did not listen to Moses because of their broken spirit and harsh slavery. The people were too crushed, too exhausted, too deeply steeped in their suffering to be able to even hear the words of hope. The mission had reached a complete impasse. Pharaoh's heart was hard. The people's spirit was broken. Moses himself was full of doubt and despair. It was at this point that the nature of the confrontation had to change. The time for words, for pleas, for simple signs was over. If Pharaoh would not listen to the voice of God, then he would be forced to witness his power. The stage was now set for a new phase of the conflict, a divine assault on the land of Egypt itself. The first tentative steps had failed. Now, the deconstruction of an empire was about to begin. But before that could happen, one final, symbolic confrontation was necessary. Moses and Aaron went before Pharaoh again. This time, they were to perform one of the signs God had given them. Aaron, as the spokesman, threw down his staff and it became a serpent. This was a direct challenge to the power of Pharaoh, as the serpent, particularly the cobra, was a symbol of royal and divine authority in Egypt, the uraeus seen on the pharaoh's crown. But Pharaoh was unimpressed. He summoned his own wise men and sorcerers, the court magicians of Egypt. They too threw down their staffs, and through their secret arts, their staffs also became serpents. For a moment it seemed as if the powers were evenly matched. The God of the Hebrews had a magic trick, but so did the priests of Egypt. Pharaoh's confidence would have soared. The power of this desert god was nothing his own experts could not replicate. But then something happened that shifted the balance. Aaron's staff, the text says, swallowed up their staffs. It was a small, symbolic, but deeply significant victory. The power of the Hebrew god was shown to be superior, capable of consuming the lesser power of the Egyptian magicians. Yet, it was not enough. The text concludes the episode with a phrase that will become a grim, percussive refrain throughout the coming ordeal. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. The demonstration of symbolic superiority had failed to move him. The time for symbols was now past. The next time Moses and Aaron came before the king, it would not be with a magical staff, but with a command that would turn the lifeblood of Egypt into a river of death. The unwanted return had ended in failure, but it had set the stage for a new and terrible beginning, a systematic, plague-by-plague dismantling of the gods, the culture, and the very fabric of Egyptian civilization. The time for words was over. The symbolic duel of the serpents had ended not with Pharaoh's submission, but with his defiance. His heart, the text tells us, was hardened, a spiritual state of stubborn, self-destructive pride. The confrontation now had to escalate. The God of the Hebrews, having been dismissed and unknown by the most powerful king on earth, was about to introduce himself. He would do so not with a whisper, but with a series of hammer blows, a terrifying, systematic, and escalating assault on the very foundations of Egyptian life, culture, and faith. What we call the 10 plagues were not just a series of random, unfortunate disasters. They were a divine act of war, a calculated and devastating deconstruction of the entire Egyptian pantheon, designed to prove, in the most visceral way imaginable, that the god of a slave nation was more powerful than all the ancient gods of the empire combined. This is the story of that war, a river of blood and a sky of darkness. The first blow was aimed at the heart of Egypt itself, the Nile River. The Nile was not just a body of water, it was the source of all life, the cradle of Egyptian civilization, the very embodiment of the divine. Its predictable annual flood brought the rich, black silt that made the desert bloom, ensuring the nation's wealth and survival. The river was personified and worshipped as the god Hapi, the lord of fertility and sustenance. The great god Osiris was believed to be immanent in its life-giving waters. The pharaoh himself, as a living god, was seen as the guarantor of the Nile's benevolence. To attack the Nile was to attack the economy, the theology, and the very identity of Egypt. God commanded Moses to take Aaron, and with the same staff that had become a serpent, to strike the water of the river in the full view of Pharaoh and his court. Aaron did as he was told. He raised the staff and struck the Nile, and in an instant, the great river, the lifeblood of the nation, transformed. The water, the text says, turned to blood. The entire river, from the delta in the north to the cataracts in the south, became a thick, foul crimson tide. The canals, the ponds, the reservoirs, even the water stored in vessels of wood and stone, all of it turned to blood. The fish in the river died, their bodies floating to the surface in a vast, stinking mass. The river itself became putrid, its stench so overpowering that the Egyptians could not bear to drink from it. The source of their life had become a source of death and corruption. This was a profound theological shock. Where was Hapi? the god of the Nile. He was powerless to protect his own body. Where was Osiris? He was suffocating in a river of gore. The plague was a direct, humiliating defeat for the foundational gods of Egypt, and it was a practical catastrophe. The people were forced to dig desperately along the banks of the river, searching for clean groundwater, their primary source of life now utterly unusable. But once again, Pharaoh's court magicians provided him with a sliver of justification for his defiance. They too, with their secret arts, managed to replicate the effect on a small scale, likely using chemical tricks to turn a small amount of water red. To Pharaoh, this proved that Moses' God was powerful but not unique. His heart remained hard. The plague lasted for 7 days, a week of thirst and stench, before the river was restored. The first great blow had been struck, but the war was just beginning. The second plague emerged directly from the first. As the bloody river teemed with death, a new form of life swarmed out of it. God commanded Aaron to stretch his staff out over the waters of Egypt, and an unimaginable multitude of frogs emerged. They came out of the river, the canals, the ponds, and they covered the entire land. This was not a natural event. It was a grotesque, slimy tide of amphibians. They were everywhere. They swarmed into the houses, into the bedrooms, onto the beds. They were in the ovens and the kneading bowls, defiling the people's food. No place was safe from the cold, clammy touch and the incessant, deafening croaking of the frogs. This too, in an ancient land, was theological warfare. The frog was a symbol of fertility and resurrection in Egypt, closely associated with the goddess Heket, a frog-headed deity who was believed to assist in childbirth. This plague was an inversion of that sacred symbol. The very emblem of life and fertility had now become a torment, a source of filth and revulsion, its endless numbers a parody of true abundance. Heket, the goddess of childbirth, was utterly powerless to stop this obscene, slimy birth that was smothering the land. This time, the plague was too personal, too invasive for Pharaoh to ignore. The frogs were in his own palace, in his own bedchamber. He summoned Moses and Aaron and made his first concession. "Plead with the Lord to take away the frogs from me and from my people," he begged, "and I will let the people go to sacrifice to the Lord." Moses agreed, even allowing Pharaoh to set the time for the miracle, to prove it was not a coincidence. Pharaoh chose the next day. The next morning, at Moses' word, the frogs died. They died in the houses, in the courtyards, in the fields. The Egyptians then had to shovel the tiny corpses into massive, reeking piles, and the stench of their decay filled the land. But the moment the physical torment was removed, the moment he had a respite, Pharaoh's resolve returned. The text says, "He hardened his heart and would not listen to them." The promise made in a moment of desperation was forgotten in a moment of relief. The third plague was born from the dust of the earth itself. God commanded Aaron to strike the dust with his staff. As he did, the dust throughout the entire land of Egypt transformed into a swarm of gnats, or perhaps lice or sand fleas. The Hebrew word is ambiguous. It was a plague of tiny, biting, inescapable insects. They swarmed over man and beast, their bites causing itching, irritation, and misery. This was a plague that violated the very concept of ritual purity. The Egyptian priests were famously meticulous about their cleanliness, shaving their entire bodies and wearing fine linen garments to ensure they were pure enough to serve their gods. To be covered in these crawling, filthy insects was a profound defilement, rendering them unable to even enter their own temples. Their gods were now cut off from them by a cloud of filth. And this time, the Egyptian magicians were powerless. They tried to replicate the miracle with their secret arts, but they could not. They could turn water to blood and summon frogs, acts of illusion or manipulation of nature. But they could not create life, even this tiny, irritating form of life, out of inanimate dust. This was a turning point. The magicians went to Pharaoh and admitted defeat. This, they declared, is the finger of God. They recognized a power that was qualitatively different from their own, a power over the very substance of creation. But even the testimony of his own experts was not enough to sway the king. Pharaoh's heart, the text grimly notes, remained hard. With the fourth plague, a new and crucial element was introduced, the theme of separation. God sent a great swarm of flies to descend upon Egypt. These were not common houseflies, but likely biting, blood-sucking flies that would form thick, buzzing clouds, tormenting people and livestock, spreading disease, and making life utterly miserable. But God told Moses he would make a distinction. "I will set apart the land of Goshen, where my people dwell," he declared, "so that no swarms of flies shall be there, that you may know that I am the Lord in the midst of the earth." For the first time, there was a visible geographical demarcation of God's power. In the Egyptian cities, the air was thick with the tormenting swarms, but just a few miles away, in the Hebrew settlements of Goshen, the air was clear. The plague was not a random natural disaster, it was a precisely targeted military strike. The God King of Egypt could not protect his own people, but the slave God of Israel could and did protect his. Pharaoh, once again tormented in his own palace, called for Moses, and a new round of desperate bargaining began. He offered a compromise. "Go, sacrifice to your God within the land." He would allow their religious rituals, but they must not leave Egypt. Moses refused. Their sacrifice required them to slaughter animals that were sacred to the Egyptians. To do so within Egypt would cause a riot. They must go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness. Pharaoh relented. "I will let you go," he said. "Only do not go very far away. Plead for me." Moses agreed. The flies disappeared, and once again, as soon as the pressure was off, Pharaoh hardened his heart and broke his promise. The divine assault now escalated, moving from plagues of annoyance and filth to plagues of destruction and death. The 5th plague struck at the very heart of the Egyptian economy and its military might. Their livestock. God sent a pestilence that swept through the herds of Egypt. The horses, the donkeys, the camels, the cattle, the sheep. They all began to die. This was a catastrophic economic blow. Livestock represented wealth, food, labor for agriculture, and, in the case of horses, the power of the Egyptian chariot corps, the ancient equivalent of a tank division. And once again, the separation was absolute. The text explicitly states that not one of the livestock of the people of Israel died. Pharaoh even sent his own officials to Goshen to verify this fact. They returned and confirmed it was true. His nation's wealth was being systematically destroyed while the property of his slaves remained untouched. Yet, even this stark, undeniable evidence of a targeted, supernatural power was not enough. Pharaoh's heart remained hard. The 6th plague brought the suffering directly to the bodies of the Egyptians themselves. God instructed Moses and Aaron to take handfuls of soot from a kiln and throw it into the air in Pharaoh's sight. As the fine ash drifted on the wind, it settled on the skin of the Egyptians and erupted into painful, festering boils. These sores covered man and beast alike, causing agonizing pain and disfigurement. The magicians of Egypt, who had been trying to stand against Moses, were so afflicted by the boils that they could not even appear before him. The priests, whose ritual purity was their lifeblood, were now rendered unclean by their own suppurating flesh. The plague of boils was a plague of personal agony and public humiliation. It demonstrated that this God could not only control the rivers and the insects, but could directly touch and torment the human body itself. And still, Pharaoh would not yield. The plagues that followed escalated to a new level of cosmic terror as the God of the Hebrews demonstrated his power not just over the creatures of the earth, but over the heavens themselves. The 7th plague was a storm of supernatural violence. God warned Pharaoh, through Moses, to bring his remaining livestock and servants in from the fields, for a storm of hail was coming, a storm such as has never been in Egypt from the day it was founded until now. Some of Pharaoh's officials, their nerve finally breaking, heeded the warning and brought their slaves and cattle to shelter, but many did not. Then, as Moses stretched out his staff toward the sky, the heavens erupted. A terrifying storm of hail, mingled with fire, rained down upon the land. The hailstones were of an unnatural size, shattering everything they touched. They destroyed the flax and barley crops that were in season, stripping the fields bare. They killed every man and beast left out in the open. It was a storm of pure destruction, a divine bombardment from the sky. And again, the land of Goshen was an island of tranquility in the midst of the storm. Not a single hailstone fell where the children of Israel lived. Pharaoh, his nation's food supply now decimated, summoned Moses in a state of genuine panic. This time his confession seemed more sincere. "This time I have sinned," he declared. "The Lord is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. Plead with the Lord, for there has been enough of God's thunder and hail. I will let you go, and you shall stay no longer." At his plea, Moses went out from the city and the storm ceased, but the pattern held. The moment the terrifying noise of the thunder and the crashing of the hail stopped, Pharaoh's pride resurfaced. He, along with his officials, hardened their hearts once more and refused to let the people go. The eighth plague continued the systematic destruction of Egypt's food supply. If the hail had destroyed the barley and flax, the locusts would take what was left. At God's command, an east wind blew for a day and a night, and in the morning it brought with it a cloud of locusts of an unimaginable density. They were a living, devouring carpet that covered the face of the land, so thick that the ground was darkened beneath them. They ate everything the hail had left behind, every plant, every blade of grass, the leaves on every tree. They turned the verdant land of Egypt into a barren, desolate wasteland. There was nothing green left in the entire kingdom. Pharaoh's officials, now facing the prospect of total famine, finally tried to reason with their king. "How long shall this man be a snare to us?" they asked. "Let the men go that they may serve the Lord their God. Do you not yet understand that Egypt is ruined?" Under this pressure, Pharaoh tried to negotiate again. He called Moses and offered another partial concession. The men could go, but they must leave their women, their children, and their livestock behind. Moses refused. "We must take our young and our old," he insisted, "our sons and our daughters and our flocks and herds, for we must hold a feast to the Lord." This was not just a religious expedition, it was the migration of a whole people. An enraged Pharaoh drove them from his presence. In response, a great west wind was summoned, which blew the locusts away into the Red Sea. But Pharaoh's heart was again hardened. The ninth plague was perhaps the most psychologically terrifying of all. It was an assault on the very source of Pharaoh's own divine identity. The sun, the chief god of the Egyptian state, particularly in the New Kingdom, was Ra, the sun god. Pharaoh himself was considered the son of Ra, his earthly incarnation. The daily rising of the sun was a symbol of the triumph of divine order over the chaos of darkness. Now, this cosmic order was to be unmade. At God's command, Moses stretched his hand toward heaven, and a profound, supernatural darkness descended upon the land of Egypt. This was not the darkness of a cloudy day or a starless night. It was a darkness that could be felt, a thick, palpable, suffocating gloom that lasted for 3 days. The Egyptians could not see one another. They could not leave their homes. They were trapped, isolated, and terrified in a world that had been robbed of its light and its chief god. Ra was powerless, blinded, defeated. But in the land of Goshen, where the Hebrews lived, there was light. After 3 days of this terrifying, sensory-depriving plague, Pharaoh summoned Moses again, his voice likely strained with fear from the oppressive darkness. He made his final, desperate compromise. "Go, serve the Lord," he said. "Your little ones also may go with you. Only let your flocks and your herds remain behind." He would let the people go, but he would keep their economic assets, their livestock, as a hostage to ensure their return. Moses refused his final offer. "Not a hoof shall be left behind," he declared, for they would need the animals for the sacrifices. This final refusal enraged Pharaoh. "Get away from me," he roared. "Take care never to see my face again, for on the day you see my face, you shall die." Moses' reply was grim and final. "As you say," he responded, "I will not see your face again." The diplomatic relations were over. The 9 plagues had systematically destroyed Egypt's environment, its economy, and its pantheon of gods. They had demonstrated the power of the Hebrew God over the water, the earth, and the sky. And still, Pharaoh, in an act of almost superhuman, self-destructive pride, refused to yield. There was only one plague left to come. It would not be an attack on nature or the economy. It would be an attack on the future of Egypt itself. A final, terrible blow that would at last break the hard heart of the king. The long war of attrition was over. The night of the passing over was at hand. The 9 blows had fallen, each one heavier and more devastating than the last. The land of Egypt was a ruin, its river violated, its fields stripped bare, its skies darkened, its gods silent and humiliated. Yet, in the heart of this devastated kingdom, one thing remained unbroken: the stubborn, prideful will of the Pharaoh. He had been tormented, he had bargained, he had been terrified, but he had not yielded. His final, furious threat to Moses, "On the day you see my face, you shall die," had drawn the final line. The process of divine persuasion through escalating disaster was over. Now, a final, terrible judgment was to be enacted. There was only one plague left to come. This would not be an attack on Egypt's resources or its environment. It would be a direct, intimate, and devastating assault on its very future, a blow so horrific that it would finally shatter the arrogance of the God-King and provide the awful, bloody price for a nation's freedom. This is the story of the 10th plague and the desperate, moonlit flight of the Exodus. Before the final blow could fall, a new set of instructions was given to the children of Israel, a solemn and meticulous ritual that was to be the foundation of their identity as a free people. This was not just a protective measure, it was the institution of a national memory, a sacred act of theatre to be reenacted for all generations to come, to ensure that the night of their liberation would never be forgotten. This was the first Passover. The instructions, delivered by God through Moses, were detailed and specific, filled with a deep and resonant symbolism. Each family was to take a lamb, a male lamb, a year old, and without blemish. It was to be a perfect specimen, the best of the flock, signifying that the sacrifice to God must be without fault. They were to take this lamb into their homes on the 10th day of the month and keep it with them for 4 days. Imagine the strange intimacy of this act. For 4 days, this lamb would live among the family. The children would perhaps play with it, feed it, give it a name. It would cease to be an anonymous animal and would become, in a small way, a part of the household. This process would make the coming sacrifice all the more personal and poignant. This was not a distant priestly ritual, it was a domestic act, a sacrifice that would cost them something. On the 14th day of the month, at twilight, the entire community of Israel was to slaughter their lambs. Then came the most crucial and mysterious instruction of all. They were to take a bunch of hyssop, a common bushy herb, dip it into the blood of the slaughtered lamb that had been collected in a basin, and paint the blood on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of their houses. This act was to be a sign, a mark of identification. The blood was a visible declaration of the sacrifice that had taken place within, a public symbol of their obedience to the command of their God. This blood was their only protection against the terror that was about to be unleashed upon the land of Egypt. With the houses marked and sealed, they were to roast the lamb over a fire. They were to eat it in a specific, prescribed manner that spoke of urgency and haste. They were to eat it with unleavened bread or matzah, a flat, cracker-like bread made without yeast. This symbolized their sudden departure. There was no time to wait for the dough to rise. They were also to eat it with bitter herbs, a tangible physical reminder of the bitterness of their slavery. And they were to eat this meal fully dressed for a journey, with their belts fastened, their sandals on their feet, and their staff in their hand. This was not a leisurely feast. It was the pre-departure meal of a fugitive people, a nation on the verge of a desperate flight into the unknown. God's final instruction was a chilling promise. "For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." And so, as darkness fell over the land, a profound and terrible silence descended. In the Egyptian households, there was likely a nervous, defiant sense of normalcy. In the Hebrew households of Goshen, there was a tense, fearful, and obedient waiting. Every family was gathered inside their blood-marked homes, eating their strange, symbolic meal in the flickering lamplight, their bags packed, their hearts pounding with a mixture of terror and a wild, unbelievable hope. They were waiting for a sound. At midnight, the sound came. It was not a thunderclap or the roar of an army. It was a silent, invisible presence that moved through the land of Egypt. The text calls it the Destroyer, an angel of death dispatched by God. This destroyer passed through every city, every town, every village, from the grandest palace to the humblest mud brick hut. And in every single household that was not marked with the blood of the lamb, the firstborn was struck dead. The text is brutally specific. From the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. No one was spared. The plague did not distinguish between rich and poor, powerful and powerless. It was an absolute, indiscriminate judgment based on a single criterion: the presence or absence of the blood. The future of Egypt, the heirs of the families, the first fruits of the livestock, was wiped out in a single, silent, terrifying moment. The immediate aftermath was a sound that shattered the midnight silence. A great and bitter cry arose throughout the entire land of Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. It was a nationwide, instantaneous explosion of grief, a sound of wailing so profound and so universal that it was unlike anything that had ever been heard before. It was the sound of a nation's heart breaking. The Pharaoh, the God King who had thought himself the master of life and death, was now just another grieving father. His own son, his heir, the future of his dynasty, lay dead in the royal palace. His pride, his stubbornness, his defiance, it was all shattered by this final, unbearable blow. His hard heart was not just softened, it was pulverized. In a state of panic and grief, he summoned Moses and Aaron in the middle of the night. His arrogance was gone, replaced by a desperate, terrified urgency. There was no more bargaining, no more negotiation. "Up, go out from among my people," he commanded, "both you and the people of Israel, and go, serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds, as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also." This last, pathetic plea, "bless me also," is a stunning reversal. The God King, the source of all blessings in his land, was now begging for a blessing from the representatives of his slaves, hoping to ward off any further horror. The command was echoed by the entire Egyptian populace. They were frantic to be rid of the Hebrews. They urged the people to send them out of the land in haste, the text says, for they said, "We shall all be dead." The fear was that if the Hebrews remained a moment longer, the plagues would continue until every last Egyptian was destroyed. In their terror, the Egyptians now willingly gave the Hebrews their valuables. The Hebrew women, following a command God had given Moses earlier, had asked their Egyptian neighbors for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. The Egyptians, desperate to speed their departure, gave them everything they asked for. This spoiling of the Egyptians was not an act of looting. It was a final, ironic transfer of wealth. The slave nation, after centuries of unpaid labor, was finally receiving its back wages, a payment given not out of justice, but out of the sheer terror of their former masters. And so, the exodus began. It was a scene of organized chaos. The signal was given, and from all over the land of Goshen, the Hebrew families emerged from their homes. They were a vast multitude, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children, along with their flocks and herds, and a mixed multitude of other slaves and disaffected Egyptians who chose to cast their lot with them. They moved with the urgency of their instructions, carrying their unleavened dough on their shoulders before it had time to rise. They began their long march out of Ramses, out of the land of their bondage, a river of humanity flowing into the wilderness under the light of a full moon. They were guided, the text tells us, by a miraculous sign of God's own presence, a pillar of cloud by day to lead them and shade them from the sun, and a pillar of fire by night to give them light. They were a nation on the move, marching towards a freedom they had never known and a promised land they had never seen. They did not take the direct route to Canaan, the coastal road known as the Way of the Philistines. God deliberately led them southward towards the Red Sea, a longer and more difficult route, lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. But this southerly route would lead them into a perfect geographical trap. Back in Egypt, as the initial shock and grief began to subside, Pharaoh and his officials had a sudden, dramatic change of heart. The reality of what they had done began to sink in. They had not just expelled a troublesome minority, they had just released their entire slave labor force. "What is this we have done?" they asked, "that we have let Israel go from serving us?" The economic catastrophe of this decision dawned upon them. Their grief curdled back into rage. Pharaoh, his hard heart seemingly restored one last time, decided to act. He would not let them escape. He mustered his army. He made ready his chariots, including a special elite corps of 600 of the best chariots in Egypt and the entire chariot force of his kingdom. It was the ancient world's equivalent of a massive armored division, the most powerful and terrifying military machine of its time, and he personally led this army in a furious pursuit of his former slaves. The Hebrew people, meanwhile, had reached the edge of the Red Sea, or more accurately the Sea of Reeds, a series of marshy lakes on the Egyptian frontier. And it was there they looked up and saw the dust cloud on the horizon. They saw the glint of the sun on the bronze of the Egyptian chariots. The trap had been sprung. Before them was the impassable sea. Behind them was the most powerful army in the world, an army bent on their slaughter and re-enslavement. The brief euphoria of their liberation evaporated in an instant and was replaced by a sheer primal terror. And in their terror, they did what they would do time and time again in the wilderness. They turned on Moses. "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness?" they cried, their voices thick with bitter, sarcastic despair. "What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." Their slave mentality, the preference for a familiar bondage over a terrifying freedom, rushed back to the surface. But Moses, his own faith now steeled by the events of the plagues, stood firm. "Fear not," he commanded the panicked crowd. "Stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent." He then turned to God, who gave him a final, incredible command. "Lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground." As the Egyptian army closed in, Moses stretched his hand out over the sea. And then the text describes the great central miracle of the entire Old Testament. A strong east wind blew all night, and it pushed the waters of the sea apart, turning the seabed into dry, walkable ground. The waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. The pillar of cloud, which had been leading the Israelites, moved behind them, becoming a barrier of thick darkness to the pursuing Egyptians, while continuing to give light to the Israelites. Throughout the night, the entire nation of Israel, the men, the women, the children, the livestock, walked through the heart of the sea on dry land, a corridor of salvation with walls of water looming on either side. As dawn broke, the Egyptian army, their vision no longer obscured, saw that their prey had escaped into the sea. Blinded by their rage, they pursued them, charging their chariots and their horsemen down into the dry seabed. But God then began to fight against them. The text says, "He threw the Egyptian army into a panic, and he clogged their chariot wheels so that they drove heavily." The chariots, the great weapons of the open plain, became bogged down and useless in the muddy, uneven ground of the seabed. The Egyptians, now terrified, realized they were not fighting a disorganized mob of slaves. They were fighting the Hebrew God himself. "Let us flee from Israel," they cried, "for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians." But it was too late. Once the last of the Israelites had reached the other shore, God gave Moses his final command. "Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, and upon their horsemen." Moses obeyed, and the walls of water collapsed. the sea returned to its normal course with a cataclysmic, violent rush. It was a watery avalanche, a tidal wave that engulfed the entire Egyptian army. The chariots, the horses, the soldiers, the pharaoh himself, according to tradition, they were all swallowed by the churning waters. Not one of them remained, the text concludes. As the morning sun rose, the people of Israel stood on the far shore and saw the bodies of their former masters, the great warriors of Egypt, washed up on the sand. The terror that had defined their lives, the power that had enslaved them for 400 years, was broken, drowned, and utterly destroyed. The impossible had happened. They were free, and in that moment of final, absolute liberation, the fear of the people turned to awe, and Miriam, the prophetess, the same sister who had watched over the basket in the reeds, took a tambourine in her hand and led the women in a great song of victory. "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea." The first great act of their story was complete. They had been delivered from bondage, but their journey was far from over. Before them lay the vast, unforgiving wilderness and the long, difficult task of learning how to be a free people. The song of triumph at the edge of the sea faded, its echoes swallowed by the vast, silent emptiness of the wilderness that now stretched before them. The bodies of the drowned Egyptian army were a final, grisly testament to the power that had delivered them, but the euphoria of that miraculous victory was as fleeting as the sea foam. Before the children of Israel lay the Shur desert, a stark, sun-scorched expanse of rock and sand. They were free, but they were also profoundly lost, a disorganized, traumatized multitude suddenly cut loose from the only reality they had ever known. They had been delivered from the tyranny of Pharaoh, but now they had to face a new set of masters: thirst, hunger, fear, and the awesome, terrifying presence of the God who had saved them. The journey from the sea to the sacred mountain of Sinai would be a brutal, transformative education, a process designed to forge a frightened rabble of former slaves into a covenanted nation, a people defined not by their bondage, but by divine law. For 3 days, they traveled into the wilderness and found no water. The initial joy of their liberation quickly curdled into the bitter, primal fear of thirst. The water skins they had filled in Egypt would have been running low, the sun beating down relentlessly. Their relief at finding an oasis, a place called Mara, turned to despair when they discovered that the water was bitter, undrinkable. The reality of their new freedom was setting in. The wilderness did not provide. It was a place of scarcity and death. And in their panic, the people did what would become a recurring, tragic theme of their 40-year journey. They murmured. They complained against Moses, their anger and fear directed at the man who had led them into this predicament. "What shall we drink?" they cried, their voices laced with the accusation that he had brought them out to this desolate place only to die of thirst. This was the first great test of Moses' leadership in the wilderness, and the first lesson in the people's education in divine dependence. Moses, in his own distress, cried out to the Lord. He was not yet the confident lawgiver. He was still the beleaguered leader, caught between a demanding God and a complaining people. God showed him a piece of wood. Moses threw it into the bitter water, and the water became sweet, drinkable. The miracle was a direct response to their need, a demonstration that this new God could provide for them even in a barren land. But it came with a condition, a first articulation of the covenant that was to come. It was at Mara that God made for them a statute and a rule, promising that if they would diligently listen to his voice and obey his commands, he would protect them from the diseases he had brought upon the Egyptians. "For I am the Lord, your healer." The message was clear. Survival in this wilderness was contingent upon obedience. From Mara, they journeyed to the oasis of Elim, a place of lush respite with 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. It was a brief, idyllic interlude, a taste of the paradise they sought, before they plunged deeper into the wilderness of sin, a vast, desolate plain between Elim and Sinai. And it was here that the second great crisis erupted, the crisis of hunger. The unleavened bread they had brought out of Egypt was gone. They were a multitude of over 500,000 people in a land with no agriculture, no reliable source of food. The memory of their miraculous deliverance at the sea was now overshadowed by the immediate gnawing pain of their empty stomachs. Once again, the entire congregation murmured against Moses and Aaron. Their complaint this time was steeped in a bitter, revisionist nostalgia for their own enslavement. "Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt," they lamented, "when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." It is a stunning statement. The reality of their brutal slavery was now being reimagined as a time of abundance, a golden age of full bellies. The familiar misery of bondage now seemed preferable to the terrifying uncertainty of freedom. They were a people with the minds of slaves, still shackled to the memory of Egypt's flesh pots. Once again, Moses took their complaint to God, and once again, God responded not with punishment, but with a miraculous daily provision that would become the defining feature of their 40 years of wandering. He promised to rain down bread from heaven for them. This provision, however, came with a strict set of rules, a daily test of their obedience and trust. Each morning, a fine, flake-like substance like frost on the ground would appear with the dew. The people called it manna, from the Hebrew question, man who? What is it? It was a food they had never seen before, with a taste like wafers made with honey. The rules were simple. Each person was to gather only as much as they needed for one day, an omer, about 2 quarts per person. They were not to hoard it, not to save any of it for the next day. This was a direct assault on the human instinct for security, a command to live in a state of absolute day-to-day dependence on God's provision. Those who disobeyed, who tried to save the manna overnight out of fear or greed, would find in the morning that it had bred worms and become foul. The second rule was related to the Sabbath. On the 6th day, they were to gather a double portion. On the 7th day, the Sabbath, no manna would appear, and they were to rest, eating the portion they had gathered the day before. The portion saved for the Sabbath, miraculously, would not spoil. This weekly rhythm of work and rest, of gathering and trusting, was a foundational lesson in the nature of the covenant. It was a rhythm that would be formally codified in the 10 Commandments, but it was taught to them here first, not through a stone tablet, but through their stomachs. The manna was more than just food. It was a daily theological education, a 40-year-long seminar on the principles of faith, trust, and Sabbath rest. The journey continued, a slow, arduous trek through the rocky, barren landscape. And then, at a place called Rephidim, the crisis of water returned, this time with a new and dangerous intensity. There was no water at all for the people to drink. The murmuring now escalated into a full-blown quarrel, a legal challenge to Moses' leadership. They quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people, tormented by thirst, were beyond reason. They grumbled against him, their words now verging on open rebellion. "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt," they accused, "to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" The text tells us they were ready to stone him. Moses, his life now in danger from his own people, cried out to God in desperation. "What shall I do with this people?" God's instruction was both a test of Moses' faith and a public vindication of his authority. He was to take some of the elders of Israel with him as witnesses. He was to take in his hand the same staff with which he had struck the Nile. He was to go to a specific rock at Horeb, and, in the sight of the elders, he was to strike the rock. Moses obeyed. He struck the great rock, and from the dry, inanimate stone, water gushed forth in a torrent, enough for the entire nation and their livestock to drink. The miracle was a stunning display of God's power to bring life from death, water from the rock. Moses named the place Massa, testing, and Meribah, quarreling, a permanent memorial to the people's failure of faith. Immediately after this crisis of thirst, a new, more tangible threat appeared on the horizon. They were attacked by the Amalekites, a fierce, nomadic desert tribe. This was the first military test for the fledgling nation of Israel. They were not a trained army, they were a disorganized column of refugees. Moses commanded a young, capable man named Joshua to choose men and go out to fight. But the battle would not be won by military strategy alone. Moses himself took on a different role. He went to the top of a hill overlooking the battlefield, taking with him his brother Aaron, another man named Hur, and the sacred staff of God. What followed was a long, grueling spiritual battle that was fought in parallel with the physical one below. As long as Moses held the staff of God aloft in his hands, the Israelites would prevail in the battle. But when his arms grew tired and he lowered the staff, the Amalekites would gain the upper hand. The fate of the battle was directly, mystically linked to the endurance of their leader. As the day wore on, Moses' arms became as heavy as lead. He could no longer hold them up. So Aaron and Hur devised a solution. They had Moses sit on a stone, and they stood on either side of him, physically holding up his hands, one on the right and one on the left. They stayed that way until the sun set, and under the power of the upheld staff, Joshua and his men utterly defeated the Amalekites. The victory was a powerful lesson. It taught them that their success in battle depended not on their own strength, but on their connection to the divine power, a connection maintained by their divinely appointed leader. Moses built an altar on the spot and named it, "The Lord is my banner," a declaration that their victories would be won under God's standard. After 3 months of this brutal educational journey, the vast column of the Israelite people finally arrived at their destination. They came to the foot of a great, jagged, granite mountain that rose dramatically from the desert floor, Mount Sinai. This was the very place where Moses had seen the burning bush, the place he had been told to bring the people to worship. Here, they made their camp, a sprawling city of tents spread out across the plain before the awesome, imposing face of the mountain. The journey was over. The forging was about to begin. This was to be the site of the most direct and terrifying encounter between God and an entire nation in the history of the world. The period of miraculous provision and chastisement was over. Now was the time for the formal establishment of the covenant, the solemnization of the relationship between the divine king and his chosen people. God summoned Moses to the mountain and gave him a message for the people, a preamble to the law that was to come. "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians," God declared, "and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." The offer was extraordinary. They were to be God's segula, his special treasured property. They were to be a nation of priests, a community that would stand as intermediaries between God and the rest of humanity. They were to be a holy nation, a people set apart, whose entire social, ethical, and ritual life was to be a reflection of the holy character of the God they served. Moses descended and relayed this offer to the elders, who relayed it to the people, and the people, in a rare moment of unified, enthusiastic faith, responded with one voice: "All that the Lord has spoken, we will do." They had formally accepted the terms. Now they had to prepare for the terrifying reality of meeting their king. The preparations were elaborate and steeped in the language of ritual purity and dangerous holiness. The people were commanded to wash their clothes and to consecrate themselves for 2 days. They were to abstain from sexual relations. They were to be made ritually clean, ready to stand in the presence of the holy. And a strict boundary was to be set around the base of the mountain. No person and no animal was to touch the mountain itself. "Whoever touches the mountain," God warned, "shall be put to death." The mountain had become a sanctuary, a holy of holies, and the raw, unmediated presence of God was a dangerous, consuming fire that mortal flesh could not endure. On the morning of the 3rd day, the theophany began. The people, gathered at the foot of the mountain, witnessed a terrifying and awesome spectacle. A thick cloud, a symbol of the divine presence that both reveals and conceals, descended upon the peak of Sinai. From within the cloud came a terrifying display of celestial power, peals of thunder that shook the very ground, and brilliant flashes of lightning. And then, a sound unlike any they had ever heard, the loud, piercing, and sustained blast of a ram's horn, a shofar, growing louder and louder. The entire mountain was enveloped in smoke, like the smoke of a kiln, because the Lord had descended upon it in fire. The mountain itself trembled violently. The people standing at the boundary were seized with a profound terror. They were witnessing the raw, untamed power of the Creator of the universe, and they were afraid. These 10 words were not just a random set of rules. They were the constitution of the new nation, the terms of the covenant treaty. The first 4 commandments defined their relationship with their divine king. They were to have no other gods before him, a radical call to monotheism in a polytheistic world. They were not to make any carved images or idols, a command that enforced the aniconic spiritual nature of their God. They were not to take his name in vain, a command to treat the divine with reverence. And they were to remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy, a weekly reminder of their Creator and their liberation. The next 6 commandments defined their relationships with one another, creating the foundation for a just and stable society. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, his wife, or anything that belongs to him. These were the basic principles of social order, the rules that would transform a mob of slaves into a coherent and holy community. When the people below heard the voice of God speaking these words directly from the heart of the fire and the thunder, their terror reached its peak. They fell back from the mountain and cried out to Moses, "You speak to us, and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, lest we die." They could not bear the direct, unmediated presence of the holy. They now understood their need for a mediator, for a prophet who could stand in the terrifying presence of God on their behalf. Moses then ascended the mountain again, this time to receive a more extensive body of law, a detailed legal code that would govern the civil and religious life of the nation. This Book of the Covenant contained laws on everything from the treatment of slaves, to property rights, to personal injury, to social justice for the poor, the widow, and the orphan. It was a comprehensive blueprint for the creation of a society based on the principles of justice, righteousness, and holiness. When Moses returned and recited all these laws to the people, they once again responded with a single voice. "All the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do." To solemnize this formal acceptance of the covenant, Moses built an altar at the foot of the mountain and set up 12 pillars, representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Young men were chosen to offer burnt offerings and peace offerings to the Lord. Moses then took half of the blood from the sacrificed animals and threw it against the altar, a symbol of God's side of the covenant. He then read the Book of the Covenant aloud to the entire assembly. After they had affirmed their commitment one last time, he took the other half of the blood and sprinkled it directly onto the people themselves. "Behold the blood of the covenant," he declared, "that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." It was a visceral, solemn, and binding ceremony. They were now a nation bound by a blood oath to the God who had saved them. A rabble of slaves had been led from the sea. At the foot of this terrifying mountain, they had been forged, through law and ritual, into the people of Israel. They had their God, they had their law, and they had their prophet. But their own capacity for self-destruction, the golden calf that lurked in their hearts, was about to be revealed. The covenant had been made. The blood had been sprinkled. The people of Israel, standing at the foot of a mountain still smouldering with the afterglow of divine presence, had with one voice accepted their new identity. They were no longer a disorganized mob of refugees. They were a holy nation, bound by a sacred treaty to the King of the universe. Their leader, Moses, the sole mediator who could stand in the terrifying gap between the human and the divine, was now summoned back up the trembling mountain. He was to ascend into the thick cloud, into the very heart of the consuming fire, to receive from God the final, permanent symbols of this new covenant, the law inscribed by the finger of God himself onto 2 tablets of stone. He took with him his young attendant, Joshua, and before he departed, he delegated his authority to his brother Aaron and another elder named Hur. "Wait here for us until we return to you," he commanded. "Behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. Whoever has a dispute, let him go to them." Then he disappeared into the cloud, and he was gone. He was gone for a day, then a week, then a month. The text tells us he was on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. For the people waiting below, this was an eternity. The terrifying spectacle of the theophany, the smoke, the fire, the thunder, the earth-shaking trumpet blasts, had faded. The cloud still clung to the summit of Sinai, a silent, ominous reminder of where their leader had gone, but the immediate visceral terror of the encounter had begun to recede. And in its place, a new and more insidious kind of fear began to grow. The anxiety of absence, the terror of divine silence. Their entire fledgling national existence was bound up in the person of Moses. He was their link to this powerful, invisible God. He was the one who had brought the plagues, who had parted the sea, who had turned bitter water sweet and drawn water from a rock. Now, their mediator was gone, swallowed by a cloud on a mountain peak. Day after day, they would have stared up at that silent summit, their hope dwindling with each passing sunset. Had God consumed him in the fire? Had he abandoned them? Was he ever coming back? The God who had been so terrifyingly present was now alarmingly absent, and the man who had been his voice was gone. The people's faith, a faith born of spectacle and terror, was not yet deep enough to endure a prolonged period of silence. Their trust was not in the invisible God, but in the visible man who represented him. With the man gone, their faith began to crumble. They were a people born and raised in Egypt, a culture saturated with visual representations of the divine. Their minds were still shaped by the stone idols of the Nile Valley, by the tangible, physical presence of gods in the form of bulls, cats, and falcons. The abstract, aniconic nature of their new God, the God who was a voice from a fire and a name that meant, "I am," was a difficult and unsettling concept. They craved a God they could see, a God they could touch, a God whose presence was not contingent on a single, missing man. This growing anxiety finally erupted into open panic and rebellion. The people, the text says, gathered themselves together to Aaron. A mob, driven by fear and spiritual impatience, surrounded the man who had been left in charge, and they made a demand that was a complete and utter repudiation of the covenant they had just sworn in blood. "Up," they demanded, "make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." This statement is a stunning portrait of a people's spiritual amnesia they were already beginning to forget. Moses was no longer the great prophet, but just this Moses, the man. They were severing their connection to their leader and, by extension, to his God. Their demand to make us gods was a direct, blatant violation of the first two commandments they had heard with their own ears from the thundering mountain. "You shall have no other gods before me," and "You shall not make for yourself a carved image." In a single moment of panicked rebellion, they were tearing up the very constitution of their new nation. This was the great test of Aaron's leadership, and in this moment, he failed catastrophically. He was a man of the people, an eloquent speaker, but he lacked the iron core of his brother's conviction. Faced with a threatening, demanding mob, his courage evaporated. He did not rebuke them. He did not remind them of the covenant they had just made. He did not counsel them to be patient and to trust in the God who had drowned Pharaoh's army. Instead, he capitulated. He gave the people exactly what they wanted, becoming the high priest of their apostasy. "Take off the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me," he commanded. This detail is significant. The gold they were wearing was part of the wealth they had received from the Egyptians on the night of their departure. They were now taking the very symbols of their liberation from slavery and melting them down to create a new god, a new form of bondage. The people eagerly complied, stripping themselves of their jewelry. Aaron took the gold, and with a graving tool, he fashioned it into the shape of a molten calf, a young bull. The choice of a golden calf was not random. It was a direct and deliberate importation of the religious imagery of the ancient world they had just left. The bull was a potent and universal symbol of strength, fertility, and divinity throughout the ancient Near East. In Egypt, the Apis bull was worshipped as a living incarnation of the god Ptah. In Canaan, the chief god El was often referred to as the bull. By creating this golden calf, Aaron was not necessarily trying to create a new god. He was likely attempting a disastrous act of syncretism. He was trying to give the invisible, terrifying YHWH a visible, familiar, and controllable form. He was trying to reduce the unnameable I am to the manageable status of a traditional idol. When the people saw the gleaming golden statue, they were ecstatic. Here, at last, was a god they could understand, a god they could see and touch. They made a declaration that was a perfect, tragic echo of Aaron's intent. "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." They attributed the great miracle of their liberation not to the invisible God of Moses, but to this inert, man-made object of gold. Aaron, now fully committed to the apostasy, then tried to give the pagan ritual a veneer of orthodox legitimacy. He built an altar before the calf and proclaimed, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord, YHWH." He was attempting to merge the worship of the golden calf with the worship of the true God, a fatal misunderstanding of the absolute, exclusive nature of the covenant. The next day, the feast began. The people rose early, brought burnt offerings and peace offerings, and then, the text says, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. The word used for play here has a dark and ominous undertone. It suggests not innocent games, but the ecstatic, frenzied, and orgiastic rites associated with pagan fertility cults. It was a scene of wild revelry at the foot of the holy mountain, a complete sensory and moral rejection of the sober, ethical, and holy covenant they had just sworn. They had traded the terrifying glory of the living God for the debased comforts of a golden idol. Meanwhile, high on the mountain, in the thick cloud of the divine presence, the betrayal was known. God spoke to Moses, his words burning with a cold, terrifying fury. "Go down," he commanded, "for your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly from the way that I commanded them." God's language is telling. He no longer calls them my people. He calls them your people, distancing himself from them, effectively disowning them and placing the full weight of their failure on Moses. He recounted their sin, the making of the calf, their worship, their blasphemous declaration. Then came the declaration of a terrible and absolute judgment. "I have seen this people," God said to Moses, "and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, and of you I will make a great nation." This was a staggering and terrifying offer. God was proposing to wipe the slate clean, to annihilate the entire nation of Israel in a single, fiery act of divine justice, and to start over, fulfilling his covenant promises to Abraham through Moses and his descendants alone. It was the offer of a second flood, a new beginning. It was a test of Moses' character, a test of who he was, the patriarch of a new tribe or the prophet of his existing rebellious people. In this moment, Moses rose to his full stature as a leader and a mediator. He was no longer the hesitant, reluctant shepherd of the burning bush. He was now a man who had spoken with God face to face, and he now turned and argued with God, not for himself, but for his people. This is one of the most audacious and powerful prayers in all of Scripture. Moses, a mere mortal, stood before the burning wrath of the Almighty and interceded, offering a series of brilliant, courageous arguments. First, he appealed to God's reputation. "O Lord," he pleaded, "why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, 'With evil intent did he bring them out, to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth?'" This was a shrewd argument. He was reminding God that his own honor was at stake. If he destroyed Israel now, the surrounding nations, particularly Egypt, would see it not as an act of justice, but as a failure of power or a demonstration of malevolence. They would say that the God of the Hebrews was powerful enough to take them out of Egypt, but not powerful enough to bring them to the promised land. Moses was appealing to God's own concern for his glory among the nations. Second, he appealed to God's promises. He reminded God of the unconditional covenant he had sworn to the patriarchs. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self, and said to them, I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have promised I will give to your offspring, and they shall inherit it forever. This was an appeal to God's own consistency and faithfulness. To destroy the people now would be to break the foundational oath upon which their entire history was built. Moses was holding God to his own word. The text concludes this extraordinary scene with a simple, stunning statement, and the Lord relented from the disaster that he had spoken of bringing on his people. Moses' intercession had worked. His courageous, selfless argument had, in the mysterious language of the text, changed God's mind. The immediate threat of total annihilation was averted. Moses then turned and began his descent from the mountain. In his hands he carried the 2 stone tablets, the tablets of the testimony, written with the finger of God, the physical embodiment of the covenant that his people had just so spectacularly shattered. As he came down the mountain, he was met by his attendant, Joshua, who had been waiting for him partway down. Joshua heard the noise of the revelry from the camp below. There is a noise of war in the camp, he said to Moses, his mind trained for military threats. But Moses, now knowing the truth, corrected him with a sad, poetic insight. It is not the sound of shouting for victory, or the sound of the cry of defeat, but the sound of singing that I hear. And then, as he came near the camp, he saw it with his own eyes. He saw the golden calf gleaming in the firelight. He saw the people, his people, dancing and singing before it in a wild, pagan frenzy. The sight of this blatant apostasy, this casual betrayal after everything he had endured on their behalf, ignited a holy rage within him. In a powerful, symbolic act, Moses' anger burned hot, and he threw the tablets out of his hands and broke them at the foot of the mountain. The shattering of the stone tablets was a perfect externalization of what had happened in the camp. The covenant, so recently made, was now broken. The physical representation of the law was in pieces, just as the law itself had been trampled underfoot. Moses then strode into the camp like an avenging angel. He seized the golden calf, the object of their worship, and he subjected it to a ritual of utter destruction and humiliation. He burned it in the fire, he ground it into a fine powder, he scattered the golden dust upon the surface of the water of the stream that flowed from the mountain, and then, in a final act of poetic justice, he made the people of Israel drink it. He forced them to ingest their own sin, to physically consume the idol they had created, a bitter, gritty reminder of their faithlessness. He then confronted his brother, Aaron. "What did this people do to you?" he demanded, "that you have brought such a great sin upon them?" Aaron's response was a masterpiece of weak, self-exculpatory excuse-making. He blamed the people, "You know the people, that they are set on evil." He minimized his own role, claiming, "I said to them, 'Let any who have gold take it off.' So they gave it to me, and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf." It is a ridiculous, childish excuse, as if the idol had simply emerged from the fire by magic, absolving him of all agency and craftsmanship. But the time for excuses was over. The time for judgment had come. Moses stood at the entrance of the camp and issued a terrible call to arms, a loyalty test. "Who is on the Lord's side? Come to me." The entire tribe of Levi, his own tribe, which included Aaron, gathered around him. And then Moses, speaking now as the grim instrument of the divine wrath that he had so recently held back, gave them a horrific command. "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, put your sword on your side, each of you, and go to and fro from gate to gate throughout the camp, and each of you kill his brother and his companion and his neighbor." The Levites obeyed. They went through the camp, and on that day they executed about 3,000 men, the ringleaders and most enthusiastic participants in the pagan revelry. It was a brutal, bloody purge, a terrible act of civil war where tribe member killed tribe member, brother killed brother. It was a necessary, horrifying surgery to cut the cancer of idolatry out of the heart of the nation before it could destroy them all. It was a stark and bloody lesson that the covenant, while a source of immense blessing, also carried within it the terrible consequences of betrayal. The great betrayal at the foot of the mountain was over. The people had been saved from total annihilation by their prophet's intercession, but they had not escaped judgment. They had been scarred, their ranks thinned, and their innocence, if they had ever had any, was now completely gone. The long, weary road through the wilderness was just beginning, and they would now walk it as a people who knew, in the most intimate and terrible way, their own profound capacity for self-destruction. The blood had been washed from the dust of the camp, but the stain on the soul of the people remained. The great betrayal of the golden calf was a wound that would never fully heal, a permanent scar on the memory of Israel. The shattered tablets of the law at the foot of Mount Sinai were a stark, physical reminder of their broken covenant, and the 3,000 dead were a testament to the terrible consequences of their faithlessness. Moses, their spurned and now fearsome leader, had saved them from the brink of annihilation through his courageous intercession, but the relationship between God and his chosen people was now fundamentally altered. The easy intimacy, the enthusiastic acceptance of the covenant was gone. In its place was a new reality, one defined by a profound awareness of God's awesome, terrifying holiness and their own deep-seated inclination to rebellion. The journey from Sinai was to be a long, weary and circular road, a 40-year purgatory in the wilderness designed to cleanse a generation of its slave mentality. It would be a time of constant challenge, of miraculous provision and bitter complaint, a long, slow tragedy that would ultimately claim not just the entire generation that had come out of Egypt, but the great lawgiver himself. This is the story of the long wandering and of a promised land that the prophet would see but never enter. After the dust had settled from the golden calf affair, Moses once again ascended the mountain to plead for his people. The breach had to be healed. He had saved them from immediate destruction, but their sin had created a distance between them and their God. God himself had declared, "I will not go up among you, lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people." The divine presence, which had once been their glory and protection, was now a mortal danger to them. The solution was the creation of a formal system of mediated worship. God gave Moses the intricate instructions for the building of the tabernacle, a portable sanctuary, a tent of meeting that would house his presence. It would be a place of immense sanctity, with a carefully ordered structure of outer courts and a holy of holies, a system of priests, Aaron and his sons, and a complex sacrificial system, all designed to create a safe and structured interface between a holy God and a sinful people. And God, in an act of grace, reissued the covenant, commanding Moses to chisel out 2 new stone tablets, upon which he would once again write the 10 Commandments. The broken law was restored. With the covenant renewed and the blueprint for the tabernacle in hand, the Israelites set out from the holy mountain. Their destination was the Promised Land, the land of Canaan, the land flowing with milk and honey that had been promised to their ancestors Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The journey should have taken a matter of weeks, but it would end up taking 40 years. The reason for this tragic delay was another catastrophic failure of faith, a rebellion born not of idolatry, but of fear. When they reached the wilderness of Paran on the southern border of Canaan, God commanded Moses to send 12 spies into the land, 1 leader from each of the 12 tribes. Their mission was to conduct a reconnaissance, to bring back a report on the nature of the land, the strength of its people, and the fortifications of its cities. The spies went out and explored the land for 40 days. They traveled from the southern desert of the Negev up to the fertile valleys of the north. They saw a land of incredible abundance, a land that truly did flow with milk and honey. As proof, they cut down a single cluster of grapes so large that it had to be carried on a pole between 2 men. They returned to the camp of Israel, their arms laden with the spectacular fruit of the land, ready to give their report to Moses and the entire congregation. The report began with the confirmation of the promise. "We came to the land to which you sent us," they declared. "It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit." A wave of excitement and anticipation must have swept through the camp. The promise was real. Their long journey was almost over, but then 10 of the 12 spies delivered a devastating addendum, a but that would extinguish all hope and poison the heart of the nation. But, they continued, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large, and besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. They went on to list the formidable peoples of the land, the Amalekites, the Hittites, the Jebusites. Their report was a litany of fear. They spoke of giants, the Anakim, in whose sight they claimed, we were like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. This evil report was a masterpiece of fear-mongering. It did not deny the goodness of the land, which made their conclusion all the more terrifying. They were essentially saying, yes, the land is wonderful, but it is utterly unconquerable. The enemies are too strong, too big. We are too weak. To attempt an invasion would be suicide. Their report was a complete rejection of the power of the God who had just drowned the entire Egyptian army in the sea. They were looking at the situation through the eyes of terrified slaves, not through the eyes of a people delivered by an all-powerful God. Only 2 of the spies, Joshua of the tribe of Ephraim and Caleb of the tribe of Judah, offered a dissenting voice. They tore their clothes in a gesture of grief and desperate protest. The land which we passed through to spy it out is an exceedingly good land, Caleb proclaimed to the congregation. If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into this land and give it to us. Do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their protection is removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. It was a powerful appeal to faith over fear, to trust in God's promise over the evidence of their own eyes. But the seeds of panic had already been sown. The people listened not to the voice of faith, but to the voice of terror. A wail of despair rose up from the entire congregation. They wept throughout the night, and their grief quickly curdled into open, mutinous rebellion. Once again, they murmured against Moses and Aaron. "Would that we had died in the land of Egypt," they cried, "or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become a prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And then they made the ultimate act of treason. "Let us choose a captain and go back to Egypt." They were ready to depose Moses and reverse the Exodus, to voluntarily walk back into the slavery from which they had just been so miraculously delivered. The entire congregation was on the verge of stoning Joshua and Caleb for their courageous dissent. At that moment of supreme crisis, the glory of the Lord, the fiery cloud of his presence, appeared at the tent of meeting before all the people. God's patience was at an end. Once again, he spoke to Moses of his intention to destroy the faithless nation. "How long will this people despise me?" he asked. "And how long will they not believe in me, in spite of all the signs that I have done among them? I will strike them with the pestilence and disinherit them, and I will make of you a nation greater and mightier than they." For the second time, God offered to start over with Moses alone. And for the second time, Moses interceded on behalf of his people, risking the divine wrath to plead for their lives. He used the same powerful arguments as before, appealing to God's reputation among the nations and to his own character, his promise to be slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression. He pleaded with God, "Please pardon the iniquity of this people, according to the greatness of your steadfast love." Once again, God relented from the threat of total annihilation. "I have pardoned, according to your word," he declared. But this pardon came with a terrible, inescapable sentence. The act of rebellion at Kadesh Barnea was the point of no return. The generation that had come out of Egypt, the generation that had seen the plagues, walked through the sea and heard the voice of God at Sinai, had proven itself to be fundamentally incapable of the faith required to inherit the promise. And so, the judgment was pronounced. "As I live," God declared, "none of the men who have seen my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and yet have put me to the test these 10 times and have not obeyed my voice, shall see the land that I swore to give to their fathers." The 10 spies who had brought the evil report were struck down by a plague and died immediately. And the entire congregation, every person 20 years old and upward who had grumbled against God was sentenced to wander in the wilderness until they were all dead. For 40 years, God decreed, 1 year for each of the 40 days that you spied out the land, you shall wander in the wilderness until your dead bodies fall in this wilderness. Only their children, the very ones they had feared would become a prey, would be allowed to enter the land. And of that entire adult generation, only 2 men would survive the 40 years and cross the Jordan, the 2 faithful spies, Joshua and Caleb. This divine decree was the beginning of the long, weary road of wandering. It was a 40-year funeral march, a slow, patient process of allowing an entire generation of slaves to die off, so that a new generation, born in the freedom and hardship of the wilderness, could take their place. The next 4 decades of the story are a chronicle of this grim journey, a repetitive cycle of hardship, rebellion, and divine judgment, all overseen by their increasingly weary and burdened leader. The rebellions took many forms. There was the political and priestly rebellion of Korah, a Levite who, along with several other leaders, challenged the authority of Moses and Aaron, declaring, "You have gone too far, for all in the congregation are holy. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord?" It was a democratic-sounding coup, but it was a challenge to God's chosen leadership. The rebellion ended with a terrifying display of divine power, as the earth literally opened up and swallowed Korah and his followers, and fire from the Lord consumed 250 other rebels. The message was clear. Leadership was not a matter of popular opinion, but of divine appointment. Throughout these long years, the daily complaints, the murmuring, continued. The people grew tired of the manna, contemptuously calling it this worthless food, and longing for the fish, the cucumbers, the melons, and the leeks of Egypt. Their ingratitude was punished by a plague of fiery serpents, whose venomous bites killed many. The cure was as strange as the plague itself. God commanded Moses to make a bronze serpent and set it on a pole. Anyone who was bitten could look upon the bronze serpent and would be healed. It was a lesson in faith, requiring them to look for healing to a symbol of the very thing that was killing them. The immense psychological toll of leading this stubborn, stiff-necked people for 40 years weighed heavily on Moses. He was their judge, their general, their prophet, their chief intercessor, and the sole target of all their frustrations. His patience, though monumental, was not infinite. And in a moment of profound weariness and anger, he made a single, tragic mistake, an act of disobedience that would cost him his life's ultimate prize. The moment came, late in the 40-year journey, at a place called Kadesh, at the waters of Meribah. Once again, the people were without water, and once again they quarreled with Moses, their complaint the same bitter refrain he had heard for decades. "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in this evil place?" God gave Moses a simple instruction. He and Aaron were to take the staff, gather the assembly, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. The command was to speak to the rock. But Moses was at the end of his rope. His anger and frustration with the people boiled over. He gathered the assembly and addressed them not as a patient leader, but as an enraged and exasperated father. "Hear now, you rebels," he shouted. "Shall we bring water for you out of this rock?" The word "we" was a subtle but significant usurpation of God's glory. And then, instead of speaking to the rock as he had been commanded, he acted out of his own anger. And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice. The water gushed forth, and the people drank. The miracle still occurred. But the act of disobedience had been committed in the sight of the whole nation, and God's judgment was swift and heartbreaking. He spoke to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not believe in me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them." In that single moment of angry disobedience, Moses had forfeited his own entry into the promised land. He had failed to represent God's holiness to the people, acting out of his own rage rather than as a faithful servant. His punishment was to share in the fate of the rebellious generation he had led. He would lead them to the very brink of their inheritance, but he would not be allowed to cross over. The final years of Moses' life were a whirlwind of activity, a race to prepare the new generation for the task that he would not be able to complete. He led them in their first military victories against the kings on the eastern side of the Jordan River. And, most importantly, he delivered his final great sermon, a series of powerful orations that are recorded in the book of Deuteronomy. In this sermon, he recounted their entire history, he reissued the law, he passionately exhorted the new generation to be faithful to the covenant, and he laid out for them the stark choice that lay before them in the new land, a choice between life and death, blessing and curse. His work was finally done. His 120-year life was at an end. God commanded him to ascend Mount Nebo, to a peak called Pisgah, which overlooked the Jordan River Valley and the entire expanse of the Promised Land. And there, God himself gave his aged servant a private, panoramic tour of the future. And the Lord showed him all the land, the text says, from the northern mountains to the southern desert, the entire beautiful, fertile expanse that was to be the home of his people. This is the land of which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, God said to him. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there. It was a moment of breathtaking, bittersweet, and tragic fulfillment. He was granted the vision, but denied the experience. And then, Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. He died alone, on the mountain, in the presence of his God. And in a final, unique act of divine intimacy, God himself buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor. But no one knows the place of his burial to this day. His grave was kept a secret, perhaps to prevent it from becoming a site of worship or pilgrimage. His life ended as it had begun, in a state of hiddenness, set apart by the hand of God. The leadership passed to his appointed successor, the faithful spy, Joshua. But the story ends with a final, magnificent eulogy for the man who had been their reluctant prophet. And there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. He was the man who had been a prince and a shepherd, a murderer and a lawgiver, a hesitant speaker who argued with God, and a fierce leader who guided a rebellious nation. He was the great mediator, the man who stood in the gap. And his ultimate tragedy was that he was a man of the wilderness, a leader perfectly suited to the harsh, transformative journey, but not to the final destination. He was the ultimate deliverer, the man who led his people out of the house of bondage and to the very shores of their own home, a home that he, their weary, flawed, and magnificent leader, would never be allowed to enter.